My name's Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our second Symposium on Science, Ethics, and Public Policy, which we co-sponsor with the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. I have to always remember that because it's a brand new school. Our symposium last year focused on the question of global warming and ethics. And our symposium this semester is going to focus on reproductive rights and religious freedom. And we have a really terrific panel for you today. We have experts on reproductive rights and ethics, on gender politics and women's policy, on reproductive biology, and on bioethics. And I will introduce each of them in turn, and each of them will take about 10 to 15 minutes to lay out an initial their initial comments, and after that we'll open up for questions and answers from the audience. Now, one representative who we hope to have with us today but was unable to attend is someone from the Catholic Church to represent the view of Catholic organizations with respect to these issues. I think my friend Bill Kabasenche is going to do some of that in any case.
I'm going to speak for the Catholic Church. I'll be the Pope's Pope.
But in lieu of that, I actually wanted to begin today's discussion with a short clip from the recent vice presidential debate, where you might remember the moderator asked both of the candidates, who both happen to be Catholic this year, about how their faith informs their views on abortion. And so we're going to see a short clip from that, and after that I'll introduce our first speaker.
What role your religion has played in your own personal views on abortion. Please talk about how you came to that.
That's it.
What role your religion has played in your own personal.
I just assured Richard I'm very technologically savvy, and now...
What role your religion has played in your own personal views on abortion. Please talk about how you came to that decision. Talk about how your religion played a part in that. And please, this is such an emotional issue for so many people in this country. Please talk personally about this, if you could. Congressman Ryan.
I don't see how a person can separate their public life from their private life or from their faith. Our faith informs us in everything we do. My faith informs me about how to take care of the vulnerable, about how to make sure that people have a chance in life. Now, you want to ask basically why I'm pro-life? It's not simply because of my Catholic faith. That's a factor, of course. But it's also because of reason and science. You know, I think about 10.5 years ago, my wife Jana and I went to Mercy Hospital in Janesville, where I was born, for our 7-week ultrasound for our firstborn child. And we saw that heartbeat. Our little baby was in the shape of a bean. And to this day, we have nicknamed our firstborn child, Liza, Bean. Now, I believe that life begins at conception. Those are the reasons why I'm pro-life. Now, I understand this is a difficult issue, and I respect people who don't agree with me on this, but the policy of a Romney administration will be to oppose abortion with the exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. What troubles me more is how this administration has handled all of these issues. Look at what they're doing through Obamacare with respect to assaulting the religious liberties of this country. They're infringing upon our first freedom, the freedom of religion, by infringing on Catholic charities, Catholic churches, Catholic hospitals. Our church should not have to sue our federal government to maintain their religious liberties. And with respect to abortion, the Democratic Party used to say they want it to be safe, legal, and rare. Now, they support it without restriction and with taxpayer funding. Taxpayer funding in Obamacare, taxpayer funding with foreign aid. The vice president himself went to China and said that he sympathized or wouldn't second guess their one-child policy of forced abortions and sterilizations. That, to me, is pretty extreme.
Vice President Biden.
My religion defines who I am, and I've been a practicing Catholic my whole life, and it has particularly informed my social doctrine. Catholic social doctrine talks about taking care of those who can't take care of themselves, people who need help. With regard to abortion, I accept my church's position on abortion as what we call de fide doctrine. Life begins at conception. That's the church's judgment. I accept it in my personal life. But I refuse to impose it on equally devout Christians and Muslims and Jews. And I just refuse to impose that on others, unlike my friend here, the congressman. I do not believe that we have a right to tell other people that women, they can't control their body. It's a decision between them and their doctor. In my view, in the Supreme Court, I'm not going to interfere with that. With regard to the assault on the Catholic Church, let me make it absolutely clear. No religious institution, Catholic or otherwise, including Catholic Social Services, Georgetown Hospital, Mercy House, any hospital, none has to either refer for contraception, none has to pay for contraception, none has to be a vehicle to get contraception in any insurance policy they provide. That is a fact. That is a fact. Now, with regard to the way in which we differ, my friend says that well, I guess he accepts Governor Romney's position now, because in the past he has argued that there's rape and forcible rape. He's argued that in the case of rape or incest, it would be a crime to engage in having an abortion. I just fundamentally disagree with my friend.
Congressman Ryan.
All I'm saying is if you believe that life begins at conception, that therefore doesn't change the definition of life. That's a principle. The policy of a Romney administration is to oppose abortion with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother.
Okay, so that's a nice introduction to our discussion today. Our first speaker is my colleague in the Department of, or the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, Bill Kabasenche. Bill currently serves as co-director of the Ethics Committee at Pullman Regional Hospital. His research explores the intersection of biomedical technologies and moral identity. He is specifically interested in how engagement with various biomedical technologies shapes us as persons and our sense of identity, and in how an individual's sense of moral identity will affect decisions concerning the use of biomedical technologies. Bill.
Thanks, Colonel. So I want to say just a few things to sort of articulate where someone might be coming from when they make what's called a conscientious refusal. And I'm going to talk primarily at the individual level, but then my toss-off is going to be to raise some questions about how this sort of argument would apply at an institutional level. So, and this kind of argument is really grounded, by way of just a very brief background, in the fact that there are distinct ethical responsibilities that healthcare professionals have as members of the healthcare professions, right? It gives them particular responsibilities that the average person doesn't have. So, for instance, a doctor at the scene of an accident has more responsibility to provide aid than does a non-medically trained individual. And by the same token, there's also a distinctive set of rights that members of healthcare professions have, again, as members of those professions. So although here in Washington State we have a social policy allowing physician-assisted suicide, no doctor is required to participate in it. They can conscientiously refuse to participate. Right? So I want to say, as I said, a little bit about what might be the justification that an individual healthcare professional would offer for taking that kind of view. And so it's going to be kind of a two-part thing. Part one, identity. And since that word came up a number of times in Cornell's introduction, maybe it's appropriate. So your identity, I think, is made up of a set of goods and values that you identify with, that make you who you are. So, for instance, my concern and affection for my wife and my children is part of my identity because I so strongly identify with their well-being, right? What's good for them is in part good for me also, to the extent that I identify with them and see them as an important part of my life. And likewise, if I hold a value closely, such as the moral equality of all persons, then I would be disturbed from the perspective of my identity to see instances of racism or sexism take place. All right? So the idea of an identity is pretty important for sort of navigating our way through life, right? We use it, if you will, as a way of orienting ourselves in moral space, okay? And then the second idea is complicity, right? And the concept of complicity is shared responsibility. If I believe, as I do, that it's wrong for me to rob banks, that means I won't rob banks. But it also means I won't be a getaway driver. I won't be complicit in somebody else's wrongdoing because I would have shared or partial responsibility for their wrongdoing, okay? And so my judgment that I won't participate in certain kinds of activities is because I think that engaging in those activities would make me complicit in the primary wrongdoing that others are doing, okay? So you put those two ideas together and it comes to this with respect to some of the issues that are on the table. Right now we've got an ongoing legal case here in the state of Washington concerning a pharmacist's right to conscientiously refuse to dispense emergency contraception or other drugs that they believe might have the potential to cause an abortion. And so I think one way to articulate what, or at least in the best cases, I don't know that all pharmacists would say it this way, but in the best cases, what the pharmacist is saying is I refuse to be complicit in an activity that violates my identity, my professional, or maybe more appropriately, my personal identity, my convictions about who and what I'm about, both as an individual and as a professional, and coupled with the judgment that to dispense certain drugs would be to become partly responsible, to become complicit with others in what the pharmacist judges to be wrongdoing, okay? So, and there are a few provisos, right? I mean, just so we're clear, I don't think that this right to conscientiously refuse means that you could refuse to refer a patient somewhere else. And I also don't think it means, as I've heard occasionally happening, that a pharmacist has a right to rip up a prescription or refuse to return it to a patient. Both of those would be instances of patient abandonment, I think. And so that's part of the distinctive responsibilities that healthcare professionals have that others don't have. You can't use your position in those sorts of ways over a person. And I don't think that conscientious refusal has to entail those things by any means. And also, it's possible that I think it's actually likely that there are geographic restrictions, so that if a patient would be specially burdened by the one pharmacist within a X number of miles refusal to dispense a medication that's necessary in a certain time period, then that would call into question whether this could be an unrestricted right. In other words, there may be some restrictions on the right to conscientiously refuse under those sorts of circumstances, okay? So that's the basic case. So, as I said, I think there are a few questions that emerge from the basic case, and this is where all the other people on the panel will talk longer than me and say things that should be of interest to all of us. First question is this, and it's an empirical question. Is it in fact the case that the kind of drugs that are under question, emergency contraception and the like, that they in fact have the potential to cause an abortion? Right? And this is an empirical question, right? This is not this isn't something that people get to decide by themselves, but rather we need to look to the best science available to come up with an answer to that kind of question. And so that's why I'm glad that Dr. Spencer is on the panel to speak to that question. And then a second sort of question, which will bring Dr. Francis and Dr. McBride into the conversation, is this. I've described a case at an individual level, right? If I'm a pharmacist and I say I refuse to dispense a medication, it's because I find that I'd be complicit and that this would be a violation of my sense of my identity as an individual, as a pharmacist. So can institutions have identities in similar sorts of ways, right? As the vice president and vice president hope to be elect, I guess, is that how you describe them? Biden and Ryan. As they talked about the issue, the current lawsuit against the federal government came up. And so this is institutions suing for a right to effectively conscientiously refuse as institutions. And so I think the other really important question for us to think about in this context is whether the kind of argument that I've described on an individual level where it is fairly widely accepted, not universally, but fairly widely accepted, whether that could apply at an institutional level. And I think at an institutional level, there's a whole new set of questions that we have to think about and a new set of complications in addressing it at that. So with that, I'm going to call it a day.
Thanks, Bill. Our next speaker is relatively new here to WSU. His name is Professor Thomas Spencer. Professor Spencer is the Baxter Professor in the Department of Animal Sciences, and he's a faculty member in the Center for Reproductive Biology here on campus. Prior to coming to WSU in 2011, Professor Spencer was a research fellow in cell and molecular biology at Baylor College of Medicine and a research professor and faculty fellow at Texas A&M University. Dr. Spencer's research has contributed significant advancements to the science of uterine biology, and it aims at the prevention and treatment of infertility and pregnancy loss in both human beings and domesticated animals. Dr. Spencer.
So I certainly appreciate the invitation to come here, and what I'd really like to do today is specifically just talk about the science behind contraception, because as many of the things that we take in our bodies and are prescribed by medical doctors, oftentimes we don't always fully understand specifically what is involved in the actions of them. So the Affordable Care Act actually requires all insurance companies to cover well woman visits, gestational diabetes screenings, domestic and interpersonal violence counseling, FDA-approved contraception, breastfeeding supplies, HPV or herpes virus DNA testing, sexually transmitted infection counseling, and HIV testing without additional copays. And so actually you can download a free publication from the FDA that specifically I'd like to talk about in terms of contraception. So if you look at the FDA-approved birth control guide, this is basically the different types of birth control methods which are approved by the Food and Drug Administration that are covered under the Affordable Care Act. And so this includes barrier methods such as condoms, diaphragm, sponge, cervical cap, and spermicides. Hormonal methods, which are probably the most employed in the U.S., including oral contraceptives, such as the birth control pill, patches, which are basically the equivalent of them, cervical rings, which also produce contraceptives, as well as is not a popular alternative, which is a long-acting shot. The emergency contraception, which is what I'll discuss more today, is really Plan B as well as Ella. And there are some very effective methods such as implanted devices, which are basically devices that are inserted by a medical care professional directly into the uterus, which resides in there. And actually, this is a very effective form of birth control. And then, of course, the most effective methods are permanent methods, including vasectomy of men, tubal ligation of women, as well as specific kinds of intrauterine implants. So basically, in terms of female contraception, the idea is that here, this is, if you didn't know it, this is what your uterus looks like, stylized on the internet, not for men, but just for women here. This is the ovary, and you have the fallopian tube, so the egg is ovulated by the ovary, travels down the fallopian tube. This is where fertilization occurs if there are sperm in the area. And then if a fertilized egg is fertilized, then it goes into the uterus where it establishes pregnancy some of the time. And so specifically, this emergency contraception basically tries to do one of two things. Either prevent the ovulation of an egg or prevent the implantation of a fertilized egg into the uterus. So specifically, what these two forms of contraception, and this is the most debatable forms of contraception in terms of what's come up in the state of Washington as well as nationally, are to basically prevent ovulation of an egg and if a fertilized egg or embryo is present, prevent its actual implantation into the endometrium and establishment of pregnancy. And so actually they come in two different choices. One is called the one-step or Plan B and next choice, and the other one is Ella. And basically these are pills that mimic the effects of progesterone. So progesterone is the natural progestational hormone of the body produced by the corpus luteum of the ovary and is absolutely required for pregnancy to proceed. And so both of these actually mimic the effects of progesterone, and they help prevent pregnancy after birth control failure or unprotected sex. So the bottom line is that 7 out of 8 pregnant women or women who would have gotten pregnant will not become pregnant after taking Plan B, and 6 or 7 out of every 10 women who would have not gotten pregnant will not become pregnant after taking Ella. So they have varying degrees of performance in terms of being an emergency contraceptive. And of course, these emergency contraceptives had to be taken pretty much very immediately after unprotected sex, and which is why you have to go to a pharmacist to get these. And so this actually shows you fertilization of an egg by a sperm. And what we're really trying to prevent with these emergency contraceptives is either ovulation of an egg, or if you have fertilization, which happens pretty rapidly after ovulation, which would be day 1. And then actually pregnancy is established roughly 5 days later, that is fully recognized by the maternal system. And so even by literally 1 week after fertilization, you have implantation of the embryo, and what these emergency contraceptives are trying to do is either prevent the egg from ever being ovulated and thus not be available for fertilization, or prevent implantation of the fertilized or the embryo into the endometrium. So, and of course, this is a lot different from typically what we talk about in terms of first trimester abortions, where you're talking about dilatation and curettage and actual removal of a fully formed embryo. So these types of emergency contraceptions are a lot different from what you see with medical procedures later on in pregnancy. And also, although RU46, which is the abortion pill, which is actually not FDA approved, this is that type of abortion pill that you would see, and this is the type of situation during pregnancy that women often take that in other countries. So the final thing I wanted to leave you with is actually just a little bit of statistics on embryo loss in women. So it's kind of a fallacy that women will always get pregnant after unprotected sex. So this is actually one of the original reports in the early 80s where they were able to measure chorionic gonadotropin. So that's the hormone that shows up in urine right when the embryo enters the uterus, and so it's what causes the early pregnancy test to become positive. And actually what they found in that if you look at 200 ovulatory cycles of women, actually fecundability is only 22 to 27%, and the risk of pregnancy actually in an exposed ovulatory cycle is only about 60%, but about 60% of embryos actually will be lost during the first trimester, and most of these losses actually occur during the first 2 weeks of pregnancy without the knowledge of the mother. So in reality, getting pregnant is not as easy as you might imagine, and there's actually a large amount of normal embryo loss that occurs during pregnancy. So that's the end of my presentation.
So now we're all on the same page in terms of the science. Our next speaker is someone I've known for, I was just thinking, 30 years, I think. I used to babysit her children. It's a long time ago. Leslie Francis is the Alfred C. Emery Professor of Law and a Professor of Philosophy at the University of Utah. She also has joint appointments in the Family and Preventive Medicine and Internal Medicine at the Medical School at the University of Utah and in the Political Science Department as well. Professor Francis currently serves as a member of the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics and is a member of the Executive Committee of the International Association for Philosophy of Law and Social Philosophy. Professor Francis has just recently been asked to edit Oxford's Handbook on Reproductive Ethics and is an incoming member of the Ethics Committee of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine.
Thanks. So, first of all, it's wonderful to see so many of you here. Thanks. So, I want to set up first what looks a little bit like a paradox. We have people who are defending liberties of women and at the same time apparently arguing against liberties of pharmacists. Both of these are important liberties. In the one case, it's reproductive liberty, which is, as Bill said, critical to identity. In another case, it's one's conception of one's faith and one's conception of what kind of a professional one wants to be, which is also central to identity. But I don't actually think it's a paradox, because what I want to unpack for you a bit using the way I think about issues as a philosopher of law is why the arguments for women's reproductive liberty, the kind of position Vice President Biden took, are much stronger arguments than the Catholic Church's argument about not providing, not having Catholic institutions such as Georgetown University provide insurance plans that include contraceptives, and why the pharmacist's argument about Plan B is actually somewhere in the middle. That's the really hardest case. And I hope I'll unpack that a little bit and show that to you. So I think that anytime we've got important liberties on the table and there's talk about the use of state power to restrict them in some way or another, we need to have a really good justification. The kinds of justifications that tend to come into play in this area, some of them are moral arguments. You know, murder is morally wrong, so we prohibit murder. Well, is abortion like murder? If it is, we'd have the same kind of moral argument for prohibiting murder. There also are faith-based arguments. These are moral arguments, but the justification for the moral principle at stake rests in religious faith. So when Representative Ryan said, my faith is why I take it that abortion is wrong, he was making a faith-based argument. I mean, he made other arguments as well. And we also will often look as justifications for restricting liberty what's been core to our traditions, social and legal, as a country. What Justice Harlan many, many years ago called interests that are implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. Okay, so let's think about what moral justifications there might be here. For Representative Ryan's position. He said life begins at conception, and that's why he thinks abortion is morally wrong. Now, what he's actually saying there is not a scientific judgment. It's a judgment about when an entity acquires the kind of moral status that's the basis for attributing right to life claims. You can't put an embryo under a microscope or look at a photograph of it and read off a little sign that says it has this moral status. There's a normative judgment of attribution of a moral status based on a reason for thinking this kind of being has the moral status that underpins the right to life. And if the argument for, and here there's actually an interesting kind of, I'm not quite sure what's meant by conception, because there are two different possibilities here, at least. One is fertilization, and the second is implantation, which is when a pregnancy has actually taken hold. And a third is the point at which twinning is no longer possible. So if his argument for saying that the right to life begins at conception, whatever that might mean, it's going to have to be something that singles out, that explains why then, and why for only the set of beings that he's interested in, let's say all human beings and not any being that has movement or life in the biological sense. Probably, and I can talk more about this later, I actually think the best argument for drawing that line is that that's when you think a being has a soul. But if that's your argument for saying that's when a being gets moral status, then you're calling on a faith-based reason. So if he's calling on a faith-based reason for his claim life begins at conception, he's calling on the kind of reason that we have a long legal and social tradition, it's called the separation of church and state, for not having those reasons play a fundamental role in the establishment of what we're doing politically. So if that's the argument, it's a weaker argument for the coercion than the kind of individual choice argument that's on the woman's side. Okay, so let me turn it around and look at what we might have in the pharmacy case and in the paying for contraception case. If we're looking at paying for contraception, first of all, what kind of an argument do we have for the moral wrongness of contraception? That's just really a faith-based argument. You know, I don't believe, as a matter of my faith, that contraception is appropriate. There isn't even the possibility that if we're talking about contraception now in the form in which we prevent you from ovulating, there's no fertilization, and barrier methods, again, which prevent fertilization. The controversial kind of contraception here would be any kind of plan B if what we're worried about is a fertilized egg that doesn't get implanted. We also are going to be concerned about IUDs that don't prevent fertilization but prevent implantation. There's been some controversy, and I need to look to the scientist about whether the way birth control pills work is some folks have argued that birth control pills actually work to prevent implantation rather than to prevent ovulation that means that you never get a fertilized embryo. So a couple of reasons why I think that not paying for an insurance plan that, or not giving somebody the money to buy an insurance plan whose own faith doesn't prohibit contraception is a pretty weak interest. You know, we require people all the time, it's called taxes, to pay for things that they don't morally approve of. I mean, our government makes a whole bunch of kinds of choices. My identity, when I have to pay for something, isn't as directly implicated as it is if I were to have to do something. Right? Another reason why it's a much, much weaker argument is there isn't even the moral argument that there might be a being with the right to life on the other side. Okay, final comment about pharmacists. Pharmacists are required to do something if, in fact, there is a requirement that they issue the prescription. And there's an important liberty interest on the side of the woman as well. And so you can make the argument that there's a real personal identity issue about a pharmacist having to fill that prescription. And what the American Pharmacy Association has said in their code of ethics is that pharmacists have a duty to put the patient first, to respect the autonomy and the best interests of the patient, but pharmacists also have a duty to respect each other's conscientious views. So their thought in figuring out how to balance these two values is that what ought to be happening in the pharmacy world is pharmacies work it out so that a conscientiously objecting pharmacist or even an entire pharmacy can not act against conscience while at the same time making sure that the woman gets the prescription that she needs. So we make sure there's always somebody on call who's willing to provide the prescription, even though a particular pharmacist doesn't have to do it. But, you know, if at the end of the day, in a particular geographic area, this is the last pharmacist in town, the balance gets struck in favor of the identity, liberty interest of the woman and not of the pharmacist. Okay, just one final comment about pharmacists. If a pharmacist refuses the morning after pill or emergency contraception, and the woman does get pregnant, that pharmacist has actually created a situation that is potentially ethically worse. Because if she does get pregnant, we've moved from the situation of the kind of gray area where we aren't even really sure there's conception. There might just be fertilization rather than implantation, to possibly a situation in which a pregnancy is actually taken hold, which is going to be ethically a lot more troubling for a lot of people. So those are a couple of arguments for thinking that the easiest case is the contraception case. The interest balance, given the way we think about the role of religion and law in the abortion case, goes with a secular state allowing liberty, and why, if at all possible, we should try to arrange things for pharmacists so they don't have to act against conscience. Thanks.
Thanks, Leslie. All right, our final speaker today is also someone I've known for quite a while, but mostly through my colleague, Amy Mazur, because Dorothy McBride is a collaborator and co-author with Amy on a number of projects. Dorothy McBride is an emeritus professor of political science in the Schmidt College of Arts and Letters at Florida Atlantic University. Her research over the years has focused on women, public policy, and women's movements in North America, Europe, France, and Russia. Her extensive publications in this area has added significantly to our understanding of how movement-based politics addresses issues affecting women around the globe, as well as how other social movements have learned from the experiences of the women's movement. Dorothy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I live in Tacoma now, so it wasn't a full flight from Florida up here, but I'm delighted to be here. We're considering the question of reproductive rights and religious freedom, and I'm looking at this from the perspective of a policy analyst, as a policy debate. And studying policy debates, I like to use some concepts to understand what's going on. And I think this case, especially of the contraceptive issue with respect to the Affordable Care Act and the bishops of the Catholic Church, is especially interesting using this approach. Well, policy debates, what do I mean by that? Well, these are structured discussions about public problems and what government should do. So key to this whole question is, what should be the role of government? We're in a democracy, and we're talking about the United States government. These debates take place in certain policy arenas. This particular debate took place a large part in the media, and also in Congress, especially last February and March. Now, who takes part in these debates are policy actors. They can be individuals and organizations, private sector, in government, from all over the place. And they are interested in the issue and they express their views. So I'm interested in studying what those views are. And the way the frame idea works and definition of the issue, and some of you who are studying policy know this already, that we can discern from the public utterances on a topic and their demands and concerns, that they have a particular definition of what the problem is that government should deal with. So when we bring up the topic of abortion, what is the problem? Is it a problem of health? Is it a problem of rights? Is it a problem of the rights of the life of the fetus? What is the particular problem that is presented to our public policymakers on abortion? I argue that over time we can discern sort of issue frames, that is, agreed upon arguments that policymakers use when the topic comes up. I think our example of the beginning of this session is a good example of such a frame. They had set out their views, the frame religious freedom and my personal decision about conception versus religious freedom and my unwillingness to impose my views on somebody else. So they could go on and argue that to the end of time, and there would be an interesting discussion. But they're all interested in a policy goal. They want the government to do something. And in order to do it the way you want it, your group, your perspective, it's important to get the way you see it into the issue frame so that the policymaker sees the issues the same way you do. And if that has to do with your rights, then you want them to see your rights as central. If you accomplish that, that is, for example, women's activists are very interested in getting policymakers to see how any policy affects women. And once they say, oh yeah, this does affect women, the minute that occurs, then women are stakeholders. They get access. And so, because they say, well, this is about women, so we represent women, you must listen to us. So there are high stakes. The other thing that's important about issue frames is where they create allies. So if you can define an issue in a particular way, you may add some other people onto your side because they also see it that way or they see their interests affected. So basically, advocates want to get their frames adopted by policymakers, and this conflict is at the heart of policy debates and a key aspect of policy change. Well, today we're considering, as I said, the question of religious freedom raised in the debate about requiring all employers to provide employees with insurance coverage for contraception. And this idea of religious freedom into a contraception debate is an attempt to change the frame of the issue. Well, contraceptive frames in public debates have changed over the years. It's not a new idea to change it. In fact, up until the 1960s, 50s, the public issue frame on contraception was that they were obscene materials and that government should prohibit. This idea came in the 19th century, and it led to the criminalization of contraception throughout every state in the country. Things changed in the early 20th century when another idea came out and said, well, actually, contraception is not about anything obscene. It's certainly not a good thing to do, but sometimes people need to prevent disease. So there are contraceptives which also prevent disease, such as condoms. They prevent sexually transmitted diseases. So you don't want to deny people the right to prevent disease. If it also prevents pregnancy, that's just something that happens. It wasn't birth control. It was doctors are able to help people who have health problems to gain contraception. There was early opening for legalization. Then into the 1940s, we had the new idea coming into the debate about birth control for family planning, healthy families, and personal choice. This idea was finally affirmed in 1965 in the case Griswold versus Connecticut, where the court ruled that the decision whether or not to get pregnant or to have, it was a sexual matter, it was a private matter, and it was something between husband and wife, and later it applied to all individuals married or not. So the idea of sexual privacy, contraception is a sexual private matter, the government should not be prohibiting this. And finally, social policy through family planning got popular in the 1970s. We still have a law in the books, which is one of the ones which, by the way, that justifies the support of Planned Parenthood, which is also a hot topic these days. The Population Services and Family Planning Act brought the government resources in to provide contraceptive services through clinics and subsidies and grants to family planning providers. Now, none of these frames were gendered. None of these really talked about women's rights. They talked more about the idea of family planning or privacy. But in 1973, with Roe v. Wade, it stimulated the pro-life movement to counter the legal abortion expansion that Roe v. Wade gave, and a new issue frame developed, which was the competition between pro-life and pro-choice. Now, from the earliest days, pro-life movement was inspired by, and there was a lot of participants from the Roman Catholic Church. And in 1968, there was a lot of, the 60s was a time when there was interest in population control and feminism and women's rights. So everybody was looking to the Roman Catholic Church, which had so far said contraception is a moral sin and use of it. So, oh, maybe they'll change their mind. I mean, modernization, liberalization. But when the encyclical on the topic came out in 1968, called Humanae Vitae, or Human Life, hopeful hearts were crushed. We base our words on the first principles of human and Christian doctrine of marriage when we obliged once more to declare that the direct interruption of the generative process already begun, and above all direct abortion, even for therapeutic reasons, are to be absolutely excluded as lawful means of regulating the number of children. Equally to be condemned, as the magisterium of the church has affirmed on many occasions, is direct sterilization, whether of the man or the woman, whether permanent or temporary. Similarly excluded in any action which either before or at the moment of or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means. In other words, sexual intercourse which is deliberately contraceptive is intrinsically wrong. There has been no update on this policy in the Roman Catholic Church since. This is the official doctrine. Now, the pro-life standard frame of the debate, as we know, is, as we've discussed earlier, the human being exists from the moment of conception. Fertilization is what they mean. And that's a specific difference between that and other debates on it, which think about abortion in terms of pregnancy, implantation. This is before implantation. So anything that interferes with that being, that fertilized egg, is murder of an innocent human being. Our current law, this is again the frame of the pro-life, the current law under Roe v. Wade is abortion on demand. So the pro-life position is to oppose any health exemption for abortion. The idea that you might have an abortion because for the health of the mother has tended to be seen as a great big huge loophole that anybody there's no limit. And our current law basically does sustain the notion of health, at least in some cases, and so it's seen as something you want to get rid of. Abortion should be illegal and criminal. Now, early in this debate on pro-life, pro-choice, there was a thought among some people that you might, and this up until the early 80s, that you might be able to actually get these people together when you talk about contraception. Contraception prevents pregnancy. Therefore, if you're not pregnant, you don't need an abortion. So if you want to prevent abortion, prevent pregnancy with contraception. And maybe pro-life, pro-choice could agree on this. Well, it turned out that wasn't the case. From the 1980s on, the pro-life argument has, although it hasn't always been front and center, it has been that contraception, especially for young people, leads to promiscuity. You get the notion that, okay, I can do anything I want to because I'm not going to get pregnant. But of course, it doesn't always work. So then you get pregnant and you had an abortion. So contraception, rather than preventing abortion, actually leads to abortion from this point of view. And then, of course, as we've heard, there's also the more recent argument that some contraceptives, rather than being contraceptive, are in fact abortifacient. They produce abortions, especially if you define the human being as the fertilized egg rather than the implanted egg in the uterus. If it's the fertilized egg and it prevents that from implantation, that then is an abortion. So we're not preventing abortion. We're actually encouraging more abortion with the pill, the IUD, emergency contraception. Well, the women's rights frame, the women's reproductive rights frame, developed since the 1970s with their perspective, which is the pro-choice standard frame. Pregnancy is a major event in women's lives. It's essential that women make the decision that to become pregnant or to end a pregnancy. They must have, otherwise they'll be pregnant against their will. And if the government prohibits them from getting an abortion or contraception, they're being coerced into pregnancy. The opposite side says, well, you know how you get pregnant, so if you just don't have sexual relations, you won't get pregnant and get married at 18 or maybe 15, would be fine. But maybe that's even too late. Now, there's a more expansive women's rights, reproductive rights frame that's important to consider here, because the argument is not just about abortion. It's not only legal abortion that's necessary to improve women's rights. Women need a full range of services and information to exercise their rights. The right to decide when to have sex and with whom. So you link issues of rape and sexual assault there. The right to knowledge and services about contraception, information, sex education, plus access to and the ability to pay for contraception. The right to prenatal care and abortion access. The rights to health care and adequate income. This is the primary gendered frame in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, and the current debate on contraception is this women's reproductive rights frame. Although there is a pro-life gendered frame as well, it's not very front and center often, but there is the argument that abortion is bad for women. Women are, in fact, keepers of life, and they should not, and abortion should be very much limited to protect women from people who force them to have abortions or men who prey on them and so on. And if you go back to the 19th century, when Susan B. Anthony is now lauded by many in the pro-life movement as being anti-abortion, she was against abortion. This is in the 1880s, when the procedure was life-threatening and illegal. And she also thought that women were subject to prey by men and their husbands particularly, and getting pregnant and pushing them to get abortions. So she just saw it as better for women that they not have access to abortion. That was in that context. But that same kind of argument is made today as well, as being a pro-woman, pro-life argument. Now today, if we look at the polls, there's widespread support and acceptance of legal contraception and the privacy position. Should government provide access to contraception and help women get it? A little less support for that, because there's a lot of people who favor a smaller government, don't want to spend the money, so those other frames come in. No more government services. Well, let's defund Planned Parenthood. It's not that I'm against contraception, but Planned Parenthood, we can't afford it. That kind of argument is there. But if you ask about contraception, and even in the debate Tuesday, we think women ought to get contraception anytime they want to, whenever they want to. So what are the bishops to do if they're opposed to contraception when there's very little support for restricting contraception in America? So they try again the moral argument, now defined as religious liberty. So, and take as a case requirement that employers provide insurance to employees, and that it include contraceptive services with no copay as part of preventive services. The bishops frame, I have a wonderful letter that just came out in August. I'm just quoting a little bit from it, one of the bishops. The Obama rule, I love the language here is very interesting. The Obama rule forbids Americans to provide health coverage unless it includes female surgical sterilizations, FDA-approved drugs for preventing pregnancy, including drugs and devices that can destroy a human life, outreach and education to promote these things among all women and girls. It's a coercive policy imposed on religious employers engaged in the common good. They're working on education and care, bringing their Christian values to the public, and now they're being forced to go against these values by allowing their employees to get contraception through insurance. They're forced to support things against their conscience, and religious freedom is necessary to resist this pressure to confine religion to houses of worship. Religion should be out in public, and this is part of it. It's not access to contraception, which is ubiquitous and inexpensive. That's not what we're concerned about as bishops. It's a mandate to act against our teachings. So the argument here is, this is a frame, is not about contraception. It's about religious freedom. So if we can talk about that instead of access to contraception and women's choice, then we might be able to undercut this policy and get our position held. Okay, why is this frame coming up now? There's some different explanations. Not always, somewhat a little cynical, but I'll just share them with you. To revive the church's political clout and divert attention from the child abuse scandals. That's one assumption. Part of a larger campaign against same-sex marriage, combine these things, all things together, religious freedom, not to allow same-sex marriage. Pope Benedict's effort to rein in the American church, which he sees as too liberal. And he had a statement when he arrived here last visit about opposing efforts to confine the Catholic doctrine to the church itself and to reinforce teachings about abortion and contraception. And they've also, of course, put the nuns, the socially active nuns, on notice. They have to shape up and stop talking as though they don't hate abortion and contraception. And the Seattle bishop's been put in charge of taking care of them. That'll be interesting to watch. Timothy Dolan became cardinal in New York, and he heads the Conference of Bishops. And this is my personal question. What kind of training did he get when he went to the Vatican that he came back and started on this? He's leading the charge here. So it could be part of a deal he made to become cardinal. I only suppose, I have no evidence. Well, what's the effect of this frame? To bring allies who are concerned about religious freedom, even though they support the health policy. These include Catholic Democrats. And I watch the NewsHour every night and listen to Mark Shields and David Brooks. And Mark Shields is supposed to be the liberal, and David Brooks is supposed to be the conservative. And they both said, this is the worst thing Obama's ever done. He'll never get over this. This is a terrible thing. I said, what's wrong with him? Well, he's a Roman Catholic. So as a Roman Catholic leftist, he buys the argument about religious freedom. And they all say, oh, well, everybody can get contraception. So we don't have to force them. This is not about that. This is about religion. Polls show overwhelming support for contraception, but when you ask them about the question of the government requirement here, 42% say religiously affiliated colleges and universities should be exempt from providing this insurance or allowing it to be provided. New York Times poll in March said that 57% claim that employers should be able to opt out based on religious and moral objections from allowing the insurance that they provide or they offer to their employees to cover what the Obama administration asked them to do. And of course, it made Sandra, F-L-U-K-E. Now, I was told that Sandra, I used to call her Sandra Fluke. You all know who she is, Sandra Fluke? And then I just went to an event the other day, she said, it's Fluck. So Sandra Fluke, or Fluck, became a national figure, speaking of the Democratic Convention, because she was a Georgetown student who said, we need access to contraceptives. And then Rush Limbaugh, of course, called her, she was a nice person, she was a slut because she used contraception, or looked for it everywhere, so she could have a promiscuous sex life. Oh, how do you counter the argument? What are the women's reproductive frames coming about contraception? Well, there's a lot of them, and they're on the case. This action by bishops is to restrict women's health and contraception access. It's about women's health. It's not about religious freedom. So see here, I don't want this frame changed. This frame has got to be about women's rights, not about religious freedom. And actually, a poll in March showed that 51% agreed that this is about women's health and rights and not about religious freedom. 37% said it was religious freedom. So, I got polls that say, okay, it's a mushy situation, the way polls often are. Now, while the majority of women have access to contraception, there are problems for the poor, especially minority and poor white women, which is where you find higher abortion rates and it's a declining women's health. There's some research just came out and showed that the life expectancy of poor white women has declined in the last 10 years. And what are the reasons? One of the reasons is they have more children than everybody else. They don't have access to family planning and contraception. It's an old argument, still viable from this perspective. The Center for Reproductive, I'm just out of time. A couple minutes? I am just about done. The rash of recent misogynistic attacks. Okay, so call Rush Limbaugh misogynist. From the verbal assault on Georgetown law student Sandra Fluke to the head of the U.S. Council of Bishops' sweeping dismissal of women's rights has taken the public debate to shocking, demeaning extremes. So there's some excessive language coming from the Center for Reproductive Rights. You want to talk about religious liberty? Okay, here's the response. The right of an individual to live according to his or her own religious conscience. You've heard some of the arguments, the philosophical argument there, presented into public policy. It's not whether religious liberty should be protected, but whose religious liberty? Conscience rights belong to individuals, not institutions, they state. The new policy responds to the concerns of religious objecting institutions without sacrificing individual workers' rights. And finally, another frame from the presidential debate Tuesday. The President Obama said in that discussion, if any of you saw it, he was asked about what have you done for women lately, and he talks about this contraceptive policy that requires preventive care to include contraception in the health insurance. Contraception is not just a women's issue. Now, that's a strategic frame to say, okay, it's not just women, it's bigger, it's families. It's an economic issue. That's the big issue in the campaign, economics. It's about money. It's about the cost of contraception and the ability to keep a job and to keep your less than equal pay coming in, but still supporting your family. And therefore, it's a family issue. So here's strategic degendering we see if it's just a women's issue, sometimes, and this always, as on my own, in my personal life, a pro-women's rights person, I always say, well, what's wrong with just being a women's issue? Isn't that all right? But in terms of the strategy of gaining allies, sometimes you just have to say, well, it's not just about us, it's about everybody, it's about you. You know, if you're married to someone who can't plan her pregnancies, probably not, or you have a partner who can't plan pregnancies because he can't get contraception, it's not a pleasant environment perhaps. So this is good for everybody to be able to have access.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers, and I'm going to ask for you to raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone up so we can get it on the tape. Perhaps I'll go ahead and start and ask the first one. I think this is a question mostly for Leslie, although any of you can jump in. And I'm going to borrow the framing language that Dorothy brought up. It seems to me that your argument, Leslie, that that Paul Ryan's position, or his argument is in the weakest position, is based in part on the frame that it's a faith-based view that life begins at conception. And that the First Amendment prevents those types of claims or gives them less status than other claims for making public policy. Now, I think the position that Paul Ryan and Catholics would take is that's the wrong way to think about the First Amendment, that's a hyper-individualist way to think about freedom of religion, and doesn't recognize the status of communities of faith, that they should be able to, a faith-based claim should have as much status as other types of claims in public policy making. So how would you respond to that?
So the point that you're making is, let's think about the extent to which reliance on religious reasons should be a ground for use of state power. And if it's right that certainly, there isn't even the right to life argument when we're dealing with contraception, at least if it's genuine contraception. But if it's right that the best argument for saying moral status of the kind we're interested in starts at the moment of fertilization is in fact a religiously rooted one, we're going to have to countenance in U.S. politics the use, what I could call the generalization of religiously based reasons as a ground for coercion. Now, that may be the way we want to frame, that may be the way we want to structure our political life, but historically that's not been how we've structured our political life. And it would be a shift. That's the only point I was making. Maybe I could just add while you're waiting, there's a difference between imposing my religion on you and making me do something that's against my religion.
I just wanted to add about Sandra Fleck. She was on C-SPAN with a panel held at Southern Methodist University, and she clarified what her position was with Georgetown University with regard to contraception and not covering. It was the coverage of students who paid for student insurance that were not being availed contraception. Yet employees of the university, their insurance policies covered the employees' contraception. That was number one. Number two, the problem I have with Ryan and Romney and those that are against contraception being available is Title X that was passed in 1970. It's taken 40 years for women to get to the point where they are now, and they want to turn the clock back to the 1960s. I grew up in the 60s. I was a teenager. I had friends in high school, we lived in Arizona, that had to drive to Nogales, Arizona to get abortions. So women's life and women's health was in jeopardy because they could not find a legal abortion or afford a legal abortion. The only people that were getting legal, quote, abortions were women that had money.
From an ethical standpoint, wouldn't forcing your religious views regarding contraception be unethical? Mostly for Dr. Kabasenche?
I think it would be. But, I guess I'm not sure that that's what the case under consideration is about, though, right? In fact, the parties to the lawsuit are complaining that the government is forcing a rich conception of the good on them, right? So they're disallowing them the opportunity to practice their identity.
You know, Washington State's policy about as I understand the Washington law about pharmacies, it's a pretty strong law. I mean, it requires the pharmacy to fill the prescription.
Actually, it just got overruled, now it's in appeal.
It's on but that's what it would require.
That's what was overruled.
Is
Yeah,
it not true that it's just for females 17 and under, because 17 and 18 and over, it's an over-the-counter medication. So we're dealing with the youth thing as well. It is, FDA.
Okay.
Hillary Clinton, you don't remember? Anyway. They held up everything in Congress just to get the FDA to finally make it an over-counter for 18-year-olds and over women. So.
Okay, we're back here.
I just had I thought when we were watching the debate, the pro-life, he said that they would make exceptions for rape, incest, or health of the mother. And I find it really interesting that if their view is it's killing a baby because its life begins at conception, why is there ever an exception? Maybe the health of the mother makes more sense because it could be possible death, but I'm pro-life, and I feel like if I were to be raped, it's not my duty or choice or whatever to kill ever, no matter what the situation. So why is that an exception ever if his argument is life begins at conception?
I think you're, sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to say that from the policy debate perspective. He doesn't believe that, Ryan. He said what he believes, but in the election, it is not a popular position with women to not have any exception, because once you bring up the rape, or incest, people say that's too extreme. Americans want a moderate policy on abortion. They don't want to go this far, they don't go that way. So it's a strategy, and he doesn't believe it, but Romney is saying that's his position, so you don't have to be afraid of him because he's not as extreme. I don't think it's illogical. I mean, it can't be understood in terms of, because you're absolutely right. If it's murder in all those cases.
Yeah, and you might be able to argue that when you've got life on one side and life on the other side, the interests are comparable. So if there's going to be an exception, it would be the life of the mother exception. The rape doesn't come in there at all. And health, depending on what level of risk and so on, you've got an issue there about what kinds of interests you're balancing. But there's another doctrine here that we haven't talked about, the idea that letting die is different from killing. And so even the life argument, at least if you hold the view that it's wrong to act to cause the death, even if you know that by not acting, you will be letting the mother die, the whole double effect doctrine discussion, you're in a position in which you probably shouldn't even be accepting for the life of the mother.
By the way, I
Let
should
me-
explain, since I made the clip and I cut it off, Paul Ryan actually goes on to say that as a matter of principle, he believes in no exceptions.
Yeah,
But as a matter of policy, they believe in exceptions. So he drew that distinction.
yeah. And that is the consistent position.
I was just going to throw out that there is a philosopher, Judith Jarvis Thompson, who she makes an argument that could be used to explain exceptions in cases like rape and incest. And essentially, it's by arguing that there are more considerations besides the moral status of early human lives. Another prominent one, obviously, would be the ability of the woman to control her body, right? So in cases of rape or incest, because these are forcible sexual activities, the woman isn't able to control her body at that early stage, right? So Thompson's view is if a woman has taken all reasonable precautions to avoid pregnancy, she can't be held responsible for a pregnancy that ensues. But in cases of rape or incest, presumably the woman has done nothing that could even be claimed to make her responsible.
Yeah, another piece of Thompson's argument is that she's reframed the whole thing so it doesn't follow from the claim that the fetus has a right to life that I have an obligation to provide it with the means of life. I only do if I've assumed that by being careless or something like that.
But, even in the Thompson position too, I guess what I don't understand, and it gets back to the question back there, is, either you shouldn't allow it at all, or once you start allowing exceptions, like the argument that you just framed, Bill, there have to be other exceptions too, right? I mean, a young married couple can take very reasonable precautions, and get pregnant nonetheless, right? I mean, actually, there are cases where somebody could have a vasectomy, and
There have been cases.
right, and I mean, how reasonable do the precautions have to be? So once you start considering certain kinds of policy exceptions, how could you possibly just stop with? And incest doesn't even make any sense to me. I mean, either you're talking actually about rape, but I mean, are you telling me two first cousins, they're
Father
allowable
and the
to?
daughter. She's pregnant by her father, those.
But isn't that a case of rape or statutory
Well,
rape or
yeah.
something like that? So then it seems like a sort of redundant kind of clause. I mean, the whole thing seems a little.
Well, so Thompson's argument is there are other considerations, right? And you're right. I mean, it takes, you have to look at all the different kinds of moral considerations in order to come to a judgment. And also, I should say that I don't think Thompson means for her argument in the paper we've been talking about to be used as policy, because it really would depend on whether you could know whether a couple had taken all reasonable precautions. And a judge, a police officer. Yeah.
She can accept that it expands because
Yeah.
she's not talking about policy.
Yeah, you can't know that. But yeah, we have wild discussions of what all reasonable precautions means in my bioethics class, for sure.
I just wanted to say that the exception for rape, incest, and life of the mother does not satisfy the demand that women have for access to abortion. And it never has. It is a very tiny area. First of all, you can't even prove rape. It takes 2 years in court, so already it's not a very good exception. And they always say, well, you can come in and say you were raped, but we don't believe it. So there's all this judgment on what the women's decision is. So women, this is something that convinced me many years ago, and it was a philosophy seminar when I was in college. No, I was the first working at Florida Atlantic, that convinced me about this, which was what the difference between my personal view and what should policy be. And policies that criminalize abortion do not stop abortion. Women have had abortions since forever, and they will in the future. So what is the policy that's going to be most humane and limit abortion is the thing we want to think about, not criminalize and try and stop it. So it's kind of, I think that decision, and you mentioned it, what's policy versus what's my personal ethical view on the subject.
To underline something, I think you made the point about the hope for a compromise on contraception getting derailed is a really important point, because if you've got moral doubts about abortion, you really, unless the sort of weirdness about we're going to suddenly get, everything short of whoopee and massive promiscuity if contraceptives are available. You really want to try to avoid that moral problem if you possibly can, which means good support for access to contraception, which is why, to me, it's just sadly ironic that the two liberty positions have gotten, put as though they were on the same footing.
We have time for one last question.
I just want to briefly revisit a previous question where someone talked about whether there's an issue of bioethics that have been compromised. Why isn't it unethical for the Catholic Church to force their opinions on people who are not Catholic but work for them? Isn't denying them access to birth control hypocritical? You earlier suggested that it is not an issue of bioethics, and I disagree with that. If I'm not Catholic and I'm working at Notre Dame or a Catholic institution, I don't see that they have the right to tell me that I do not have access to that birth control. I see that as an infringement upon my rights and my religious beliefs.
So what if an institution, right? I'm going to sort of try to bring us back maybe to this question of whether there can be an institutional identity and whether that could be a ground for conscientious refusal. I don't know if this is the case, but what if an institution very publicly said, this is our view, this is our identity, these are things that we will and won't do, and I take it that if they've done anything, the Catholic Church has been clear about their views on a lot of issues. They keep beating on them, no matter what. So an institution says, this is our identity, and then you're not compelled to work for us, but if you do work for us, we expect that you will live and work under the rubric of the identity that we are claiming as an institution. Right? Now, in real life, we might have to make exceptions for people who didn't know when they went to Georgetown or Notre Dame that this was a Catholic institution and didn't know what the Catholic Church's view. I mean, I don't know. But for people coming in, they could know they're free to gain employment elsewhere. Right? Their liberty isn't restricted in the sense that they have to work here and not elsewhere. Right? So under those circumstances, would it be okay for an institution to say, as the individual pharmacist says, this is inconsistent with our identity, and you're free to work here or not, but we want to maintain this identity? I guess I'm not clear on why an institution couldn't do something similar to what an individual does there. And also, I guess I may say one more thing. If the government were to say that some institutional identities or some parts of institutional identities are unacceptable, then we're really in a place where I think democracy is being threatened under those sort of circumstances. So.
But Bill, let me push you a little bit on that. I mean, you wouldn't say the same thing if an institution said our institutional identity is not to hire blacks, for instance.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say they should have the right to do that.
Sure. So, yeah, and I recognize there's going to be there's going to be some ambiguity here. It may be that there are some moral issues, right? And racism is ultimately a moral issue on which there's sufficient consensus that we think it should be part of the semi-thick conception of the good that the government imposes on all institutions and individuals, right? Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that and again, I take it that the lawsuit is really, I guess, is it about, maybe it's about contraception, but contraception because contraceptive devices, or at least some of them, have the potential to be abortifacients. It's insofar as that's the
They're
case.
against contraception altogether.
Yeah.
It's not just the abortifacient. They are
Right.
against it altogether.
Well, I understand that,
Yeah,
but
so
for
in
the
other words, it's not-
for the purposes of the lawsuit, we can make a hypothetical, right? I guess if an institution said, although we're opposed to abortion, we're not going to prohibit that to our employees, but we do think that abortion is a sufficiently morally serious sort of issue, and it's one about which there remains a great deal of controversy. It's not an issue on which the state should take a view and impose it, right? I mean, could an institution not say something like that? You know?
Well, they can. They can say whatever they want.
Well, would they not be more justified on that kind of issue than on an issue like racism or sexism, where I take it that we're much further along in the moral discussion and there's much more consensus towards what I think are the right kind of views about those issues? So I'm not going to support Bob Jones.
I think Leslie wants to get it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just going to say, I don't think Georgetown University takes that kind of position. I mean, they haven't been the kind of, there are faith-based universities that take very open positions with respect to needing to live a certain kind of moral life if you're going to work there. The university that's just to the south of the university where I teach, Brigham Young University, takes a very, you have to, if you teach at Brigham Young University, or if you're a student at Brigham Young University, you are expected to live by the tenets of the LDS faith. You don't have to be LDS, but you have to live by the rule, and they're utterly open about that. An athlete at BYU who gets his girlfriend pregnant is expelled. Yeah. And now that's a very different view than, I mean, Georgetown University doesn't think that you have to be a Catholic or even live as a Catholic would to work at Georgetown University or to be a student at Georgetown University.
And the public policy, both this Obamacare and the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, it does exempt specifically religious institutions. I mean, the church.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church has,
Right.
in a particular local Catholic church has employees, or they have employees in the diocese, and they're all working for the church and they're all Catholic. They don't have to provide this insurance. This is the exception. But if they're out in the community providing social service, which they do through hospitals and universities, that's who does have to. Same thing with Title VII. If your policy is only to hire Mormons, for example, in a Mormon teaching institution, and everybody has to be a Mormon, that's an exception. You can do that to the rule of equal opportunity. So they do take the specific where the employees are also the faithful. So this is a difference between those and the employees who are not necessarily part of the faithful or subscribe to the values.
Unfortunately, I think our time is up. Before I ask you to join me in thanking our guests, I have a couple of announcements. If you're here for the Common Reading Program, you need a stamp, or you're here for a class, you want to do a sign-up sheet, there will be in the back, in the hallway, as soon as you leave. I also have an announcement. We have another Foley event, Foley Institute event on Monday at noon in the Bundy Reading Room. It's a presentation on rhetoric and the death penalty, so I invite you to come to that. It's a coffee and or pizza and politics, so there'll be pizza there. And now I want to thank you on behalf of the Institute for coming out on a very nice day. I know it's hard to come inside when the sun's shining, but it's been, I think, worth your while. We had a very informative discussion. Join me now in thanking our panelists.